Welcome to Rapid Underscore. I'm Thomas Parslow and I'll be introducing you to the Underscore.js library. In this video, I just want to give you a taste of why you'd want to look at Underscore, and I'll introduce the projects we'll be building together over the coming videos. So what is Underscore? It's a library full of useful little functions that are helpful when writing JavaScript. It's definitely not a framework. You can use the functions from Underscore if you're writing plain JS, using jQuery, or even using a full framework like Backbone or Angular.js. The functions it contains cover a fairly wide range of uses, but they tend to encourage a more functional style of coding, which is an increasingly popular style of programming that makes a lot of use of functions and makes codes easier to think about and less error-prone. A lot of the time, the functions in Underscore let you reduce the size of your code and make your intentions more obvious. For example, you might take this code and replace it with this code down here using Underscore's filter method. Don't worry if you don't understand this yet, we're going to be looking at all this stuff later. So Underscore contains a lot of functions. We're not going to be able to cover all of them, but we should be able to give you a good idea of the kinds of ways you can use Underscore. As part of the upcoming videos, we'll be building an example application. This application will help users to find the best time to see the International Space Station from their location. The ISS, or the International Space Station, has been orbiting the Earth since it was launched in 1998 and always has at least a few astronauts on board. It completes 15.5 orbits of the Earth every day, and it's the brightest man-made object in the sky and is visible with the naked eye. So for any given location there's going to be a few flyovers per day, but depending on cloud cover it may not always be possible to see it. So what our application is going to do is it's going to correlate weather data with ISS flyover time data so the user can always find a good time to spot the station. Let's get the project started now. First let's create a directory, and then let's switch into it, and we're going to want to create an HTML file. And in here we're going to put the standard HTML boilerplate, and let's set the title. Now we're going to want to include some CSS, and let's just use the Bootstrap CSS library just to get things going quickly. Let's add one custom bit of CSS. I'm going to make the main container, which we'll create in a minute, 600 px wide. It's going to make it look a little bit better. You just have to trust me on that for the moment. So once we got that done, let's go and add the basic HTML structure for the page into which the JavaScript will insert stuff later. So let's create the container div. It's just a container which is a class from Bootstrap. Now let's add somewhere to add the flyover data. Give it an ID so we can find it from JavaScript later. Now we want a header section which is going to have an h1 in it, so a page header. So let's again add that. Let's add the h1, set the title to see the station, spot the ISS, and then let's also add a refresh button, which we'll hook up from JavaScript later on. But for now we're just putting the HTML into the page. So we give that a little container, and then we add an HTML button. And we're going to give it some classes from Bootstrap again, just to give it a default button style. Right, so we're going to do that, and now all we need is to include some JavaScript. So let's add another scripts tag at the bottom, and it's going to be scripts.js. So let's create that file right now. We're not going to put any code in it for the moment, so let's just leave it as a blank file. Okay, that'll do for this video. Join me in the next video when we'll see how Underscore can be included in the page, and we'll move on to actually trying out some of the functions that Underscore provides and seeing how they help with the application we're building. Welcome back. Now that you've seen how Underscore.js can be a useful addition to your toolbox, let's have a quick look at how you can use it in your web or Node.js-based project. In this video, we're going to download Underscore and include it in a page. We'll then look at an alternative way to install Underscore using the Bower Package Manager, and finally we'll look at using Underscore in Node.js. The simplest way to get Underscore is to go to Underscore.js.org and download it. It comes as a single JS file and you can simply save it into your project directory. I'm picking the development version here. It's a larger file, but it has lots of useful comments if we ever want to go poking around inside the source. With Underscore.js downloaded, we can go to the project directory and open the HTML page, and let's add a scripts tag. So we're going to add a scripts tag, and we're going to refer to the file we just downloaded, Underscore.js. Underscore.js uses the underscore character as its namespace, so if we load this file up in the browser now, we can check that underscore is on the page. So we open that up, and then we check, and we can see that it's on the page. As an alternative to manually download the underscore, we can use the Bower package manager. This makes it easier to use underscore without having to check it into our source control repository. With a project set up for Bower, we can just type bower install underscore and grab it. Let's add the save flag so it will record the version we used in our bower.json file. As before, we include Underscore.js in our page with a script tag. Bower will install underscore into the underscore folder in the Bower components folder. Once we've done that, we can switch to Chrome and check that it all works correctly. So let's save that. Let's open it up in Chrome, check again, is it there? And yes, it's worked. So that's how to get Underscore.js ready for use in the browser. But let's take a brief detour now and see how we can get it to work from a Node.js application. After this quick detour, we'll go back to the browser for the rest of the examples, but all the things we're going to learn in this video course work just as well in Node.js. So here's a basic Node.js project. First, let's install Underscore.js into our Node modules directory using npm. We can type npm install underscore and let's add the save flag to automatically add the version information to our package.json file. And we can see that it's now added to the Node modules folder and to our package.json file. With Underscore.js added to the project, we can now require it from any module in which we want to use it. Once we've required it, we can make use of underscore from this file exactly as we would in the browser. So let's just add a console.log to test it out. And now let's go and check if it works. And yes, it's working. So we're coming to the end of this section. We've now got Underscore.js installed and we're ready to use it. In this video, we looked at how to install underscore by downloading it from underscore.js.org, or alternatively, we can use Bower. We also looked at underscore with Node.js and using npm. In the next video, when we look at some of the tools Underscore.js gives us for dealing with arrays. Welcome to section 2. In the last section, we saw how to download and include underscore in our project. In this section, we look at the tools underscore gives us for dealing with arrays, and in this first video of this section, we're going to look at the basic tools for iterating over arrays using the each and map functions that provide the cornerstone of the underscore library. You should be aware that these functions are also available natively in newer versions of JavaScript, but the ones underscore provides are a little bit more flexible, have some better compatibility, and in many cases are actually faster. So let's take a moment first to set up a project to get data. I'm going to include the jQuery library on the page because it's always useful. Now let's write a function to get the data. Remember, we're writing an app to correlate International Space Station flyovers with local weather. So first, let's grab the ISS flyover data. We're going to get that from the OpenNotify API. We'll request it via JSONP, which lets us get around some of the cross-site requesting security issues. So let's have a look at the documentation here. And we're basically just going to use this version down here. So if I just cut and paste that, I'm going to hard code the latitude and longitude for the moment to my hometown of Brighton. I'm also going to set the callback to a question mark, which is just what the jQuery library needs. Okay, so now we want the weather data. So let's add in another jQuery request to get the weather data. We're going to get the weather data from the OpenWeather API. So again, we have a look at the documentation, and again, we want it in JSONP format. So we're going to use a URL like this. Let's paste that in. And we're again going to hard code the latitude and longitudes to Brighton. Now, from Weather API, it can also take a callback parameter, so it works in JSONP mode. I'm going to do that again, and then we're going to take the result of that, and we're going to call a function with the result of both of those things, so with the ISS flyover data and the weather data. Right, let's create the function to be called. For the moment, we're just going to console log the data. So let's create the function. It accepts the ISS flyover data and the weather. And we console log out both of those things. So first the ISS data and now the weather data. That's just going to let us check that it works. So let's put in a call to our refresh data function, and let's also hook up that refresh button we created earlier so that when the user clicks the button, they refresh the data. I'll just add this parameter here to request a larger number of flyovers from the OpenNotify API. If we look at the data we're getting from the OpenNotify API, we can see that it's a JSON object, and at the stop we want is an array under the response key. Each element has a rise time, which looks like a Unix timestamp, and a duration, which looks like it's also in seconds. So let's loop over that and output it to the page. Now, the traditional way to loop over an array in JavaScript was to use a for loop. You set an iteration variable and increment each time through. It's both fiddly and error-prone. The underscore way is to use a function called each that will call a function for every item in the array. So let's create the function first. It's going to be called output flyover, and it's going to take the data for one flyover at a time. It takes as arguments both the flyover data itself and the index in the array. And let's have it add the flyover time to the page using a simple bit of jQuery. We'll combine the flyover time with a little bit of HTML, then we'll append it to the flyovers div we created earlier. We then use the each function to have this function we've created called for each item in the array. Output flyover will now be called for each item in the array. So let's check our handiwork. Well, it may not be very useful, but it's a start. So the first thing I'm sure you've noticed is that showing the times as numbers isn't very useful. So let's process the list of flyovers and replace those timestamps with JavaScript data objects. Underscore provides a useful way to loop over an array and build another array from it called map. Map works just like each, except it collects back the return values each time it calls the function. Let's make a function that takes flyover data and returns a version of the data with the rise time converted to a date. We take the flyover and we use it to create a new object. We pass through the duration as is, but the rise time we convert to a JavaScript date. I'm having to multiply it by 1000 here because JavaScript likes its timestamps in milliseconds, but the rise times we have here are in seconds. Now we call the map function, passing in our input data and the function we just created. We can modify the call to the each function down here to use our new transformed flyovers array instead of the raw data. Now let's have a look at the effect. Well, it's definitely an improvement. In this video, we've looked at the basic tools for iterating over and transforming arrays. Join me in the next video when we look at some of the great tools Underscore provides for finding and filtering items in arrays. Welcome back. Last time we looked at the basics of iterating through arrays with each and map. In this video, we're going to learn about the tools Underscore.js provides for finding and filtering items in arrays. We can now see the flyover times for the next few days. But we're missing the other feature we promised for this app, which is to show what kind of cloud cover there will be for each flyover. We've already got the weather data loaded. We've requested data for 3-hour intervals over the next 6 days. If we have a look at the data we get from the weather API, we can see that it tells us quite a lot, but we're interested in the description to show the user, and we can see that here. Let's extend the use of map we made earlier to also add weather data to each flyover item. For each flyover, we want to find the matching weather period. That is to say, we want to find the weather data which our rise time falls within. Underscore provides a useful function called find, which locates the first item in a collection for which a function you give returns true. A collection in Underscore can be either an array or an object, but we're just using arrays right now. So we just need to write a function that checks if a given weather period is the one we're looking for. And we can do that by checking the timestamp for the weather period is less than the rise time by up to 3 hours. So now the weather at flyover variable will contain weather data, or undefined if data was not found for the period we gave. Let's include the weather data with the flyover. And let's output the weather data to the page. If we reload the browser, we can see that we're now outputting weather data for flyover times. One issue that we have is we have some flyover data for which we don't have weather data. Let's only display flyovers for which we have weather data. To make it a little easier, let's add a has weather key to the flyover data. We're using the underscore isUndefined function, which does exactly what you'd expect. Now to filter out the flyovers without weather data. Underscore provides a filter function that creates a new array containing only items that match some condition. This is another example of a function that is available in newer versions of JavaScript, but Underscore's version is available everywhere and it can even be faster. Here we want to filter only items for which hasWeather is true. And if we modify the each call, we can have it use the new filtered array. Let's have a quick check to make sure this is working. So now we can see that all the flyovers shown have weather data. This works fine, but Underscore actually provides a simpler way to filter when you're filtering arrays of objects and you want certain properties to have specific values. The where function works kind of like the filter function, except that instead of taking a filter function, you instead give it an object. So because we want all the flyovers where the hasWeather property has a true value, we can just specify hasWeather true here. And this does the exact same thing as the filter function, but it's easier to read. And we can check that it's all still working. In this video, we've learned about finding and filtering arrays using Underscore with the find, filter and where functions. Join me in the next video when we look at the tools Underscore provides for sorting and grouping data. Welcome back again. Last time we looked at finding and filtering items in arrays. In this video we're going to look at sorting and grouping values in arrays. Our ISS flyover app is now showing flyover times along with the weather forecast. It would be nice to group the flyovers by day though, so the user can quickly find a given day. We want to group the flyovers by day and Underscore has just the function for the job. The groupBy function will take an array of items and a grouping function. The grouping function returns a value for each item by which they are grouped. So all we need is a function that takes the flyover and returns the day on which it occurs. We can get the day by calling the JavaScript method toDateString on the risetime date object. Now we simply use the groupBy function to group the flyovers by day. This is going to return an object where the keys are the days and the values are the lists of flyovers for that day. Let's add a console.log here so we can see for ourselves how it groups the values. We can see now that it groups the flyovers by day, so now we want to display them grouped. Let's grab the keys from this returned object. The underscore keys method returns all the keys for an object, and we'll use the native objects.keys method if it exists. We now loop over the days we have, and for each day we output a header that then output the flyovers for that day. We can get the flyovers for a given day by looking them up in the flyovers grouped variable. So now we have the flyovers groups by day when they are displayed. Maybe now we can sort the flyovers to show the ones with less cloud cover first. If we have a look at the weather data we're getting, we can see that as well as the textual description of the weather, we also have a number which indicates the level of cloudiness. So let's include the cloudiness number in our flyby data. Remember, at this part of the code we will need to take into account the possibility that there is no weather data. Now that we have the cloud data, we can sort the flyovers for each day by the amount of clouds. Underscore provides a sortBy function which we can use to sort an array of items by a given key function. Here we provide a function which extracts the cloud's data for each flyover. Now we have the flyovers for each day sorted by how many clouds. SortBy is a stable sort, so the ones with the same amount of cloud cover are still sorted by time. That's not the best way to do this sort though. Because it's so common to want to sort an array of objects by one of the object's properties, as we're doing here, Underscore provides a shortcut. So instead of providing this function which extracts the cloud property, we can just pass in a string and Underscore will do it for us. And we can see that it works exactly the same. In this section, we looked at Underscore's tools for dealing with arrays, including iterating, finding, filtering, sorting, and grouping. Join me in the next section when we look at Underscore's tools for dealing with objects. Welcome to section 3, where we're going to look at the tools Underscore.js provides to help when working with JavaScript objects. In this video we're going to see how iteration works just as well with objects as it does with arrays. We're going to use that to simplify our existing code a little, and we'll add a summary feature to the International Space Station flyover tool we've been building. Our ISS flyover app is now showing flyover times grouped by day and sorted by the amount of cloud. It will be useful to see a summary of the weather conditions over the next few days, so we can easily tell how many flyovers have clear sky. But first we're going to slightly simplify the existing code. A useful thing about Underscore's each function is that it works with objects just as well as arrays. Let me show you an example here in the JavaScript console. First I'm going to define a test function we'll use for demonstration purposes. Now let's see what happens when I use this test function with Underscore's each function and an array. You can see that the second argument to the function is the array index of each value. Now let's try calling each function passing in an object instead of an array. We're using the same test function as before. Just like with the array version, the function is called once for each value in the object. The function we gave still receives two parameters. The first is the value as before, and the second is now the key in the object, instead of an index as it was for the array. Okay, so let's go back to the code now. See here how we use the keys function to get all the keys from the flyovers group object, then pass them to the each method. And down here we use the day key to get the value from the flyovers group object. We can simplify this by just passing the flyovers group objects directly to each. The arguments to our each function are now the flyovers for the day and the day itself. So of course we now don't need this line anymore. Let's just clean up these lines as well. So let's go back and check it in the browser. And it looks like it's still working as before, so we have a successful refactor. Lots of Underscore functions can use objects as well as arrays in this manner. In fact, all the functions in the collections section and the docs do. Now let's add the summary section. But first let's add a point to attach it to the HTML. We'll add a header for the section, and we'll also add a div into which the summary data will be inserted. And now let's switch back to the JavaScript and add the code. We can get counts of flyovers for each weather description using the Underscore count by function. This works like the group by function we saw last time, but it gives us counts instead of lists. Let's just clear the summary section of the HTML first in case anything is there already. And finally we use each to iterate over the summary object, which maps weather conditions strings to counts and output a bit of HTML for each pair. This will let us see how common each weather condition is for the flyovers in the next few days. Let's have a look at this latest change now. And we can see that we do now have summary information being displayed. In this video we saw how the each function can be used with objects as well as arrays, and we learned that this applies to a bunch of other functions in Underscore as well. We also saw the count by function and added a weather conditions summary box to the top of the ISS flyovers app. In the next video we'll look at the Underscore extends function, which is used to combine objects, and we'll look at the pluck function, which can be used to extract a specific key from each of an array of objects. See you there. Welcome back to the second video of section 3. In this video we're going to look at the Underscore extend function, which is used to extend one object with the keys from another. Then we'll look at the pluck function, which is used to grab a specific key from each of an array of objects. Here's the International Space Station flyover list app we've been building. In the last video we added a summary box to show how many of the next day's flyovers have each type of weather. In this video we're going to get a new piece of data. We're going to get the list of astronauts currently on the station and display them so you know who's on that little pointed light as it passes over your head. Now, let's add a place in the HTML for the names of the astronauts. We're going to want a div to contain it all. Let's give it a little heading, and then the actual element into which we'll insert all the names using JavaScript in a minute. We can get a list of astronauts currently in space from the API kindly provided by opennotify.org. If we look at the data from the API, we can see that it gives us the name of each astronaut and where they currently are. Right now it's just the ISS, but it could be others. The first change we need is to make it load from the new data source. Again, the API supports JSONP, so we just add the callback parameter to the URL to tell jQuery to use JSONP when loading it. Let's pass the astronaut's data to the getRefreshedData function. Moving up to the top of the getRefreshedData function, we add the parameter here. I'm going to use the where function we saw in video 2.2 to get just the astronauts currently on the ISS. But I just want a list of names, not the rest of this data. I could do this using a call to map, but I'd have to write a mapper function like this. This is such a common task that Underscore provides a function to do this for us. So, instead of this call to map, I can just do this, using pluck and telling it which property I want from each object. So let's just tidy this up by deleting this unneeded version that uses map. And actually, this is short enough to write on one line. We can use the jQuery text method to set the text of the span, and we can use the arraysJoin method to create a comma-delimited array of all the names we got earlier. And here we have a list of astronauts. It would be cool if you could click on the names to see their Wikipedia pages, but we'll have to leave that for another day. In the next section, we're going to make the location user selectable. In the last bit of this video, let's just lay some of the groundwork for that. Let's put the location into a variable. We'll keep the actual values hard-coded for the moment. For the call to the weather API, we can remove the lat and long parameters from the URL string and instead pass our location object. jQuery will use it to add the parameters back in. We leave the callback parameter alone, as it's a special signal to jQuery that it can use JSONP to do a cross-domain request. For the ISS flyovers API, we want to pass in the lat and long parameters, but we also need to pass in an n parameter that tells it how many flyovers to return. We can use the _extend method to combine an object with this n parameter with the location objects containing the lat and long params. The extend method actually mutates. That is to say, it changes in place its first argument. And going back to the browser, we can see it's still working with these changes. We'll see the extend method a few more times in the coming videos. In this video, we saw how the pluck method can be used to extract keys from an array of objects, and we had a brief look at the extend method, which we'll be seeing more of later. In the next section, we'll be looking at the incredibly powerful tools that Underscore gives us for working with functions. Please do join me there. Welcome to section 4, where we're going to look at the tools Underscore.js provides that help when working with JavaScript functions. In this video, we'll look at the bind and bind-all methods of Underscore, which allow us to fix the meaning of the this variable for a function. This turns out to be very useful in a lot of situations. Here's our International Space Station Flyovers app. We're going to do another bit of refactoring in this video. Let's organize this code into a class. This isn't always the right way to go, of course, but it can be a nice way to organize your code. So let's start by creating a constructor function for our new class. We'll call it the ISS Flyover class. Next, we want to add some methods to the prototype, and here I'm using Underscore's extend method again to add properties to the prototype property of the constructor. Now we want to take the getRefreshedData function here and make it a method. And let's make this refreshData function also a method. We'll just close off that call to extend here, so we can see that this line here is closing off this one up here. Of course, we'll need to make sure that the call getRefreshedData here is now calling the method on the object, so I need to store the value of the this variable here so that we can use it down here to call the method. We have to use the me variable I just assigned because the this variable won't be set to the object instance here. Now let's create an instance of the ISS Flyover class and assign it to a variable here. And we can move these calls into the constructor function so that they're called when we create the object. We can see that it's mostly working in the browser now, except that if I click the refresh button, nothing happens. If we open the console here, we can see that we've got an error. Let's look and we can see that it's at the point we tried to call getRefreshedData. The error indicates that there isn't a getRefreshed method on the me variable, which means that the me variable can't be an instance of our ISS flyover class. What has happened here is that when the refreshedData method was called in response to the click on the refresh button, the this context that was passed in wasn't the correct object. The culprit is this line. We pass in the refreshedData method as a click handler, but of course when you pass methods around like this in JavaScript they lose their context. A solution to this problem is to bind the function to its context with the _bind method. Let's create a bound version of the method now by passing it to the bind function of underscore and assigning the results to the bound refreshedData variable. And we can then make use of it as the click handler. If we go back to the browser and we refresh, we can now see that the refresh button is working properly again. You might want to just overwrite the method with a bound version of itself, so you never have to worry about binding it when you use it. Now we can use this.refreshedData anywhere we like, and it'll just work. Underscore actually has a shortcut for this line. Instead of calling underscore.bind and overwriting the method with the return, we can call bindAll and tell it the object in the method name, and underscore will do it for us. And we can even pass in multiple method names to bindAll at once, to bind multiple methods at the same time. And let's just see that it's all still working. Refresh, and good, it is still working. In this video we saw another example of the use of the extend function to add properties to an existing object. Then we saw how to use the bind and bindAll functions to bind a method's this context to make it easier to pass around. In the next video we're going to extend the app to take a user-specified position, and we're going to see how underscore's debounce method can be used to ensure that a function isn't called too often. Hope to see you there. Welcome back to the second video of section 4. In this video we'll be looking at the debounce method of Underscore.js. This function is really useful when we have some sort of input, usually from the user, that can come in really fast and we only want to deal with it when it has stopped changing. Here's our International Space Station Flyovers app. Up to this point we've had the location hard-coded, but it would be nicer if we allowed the user to select a location. Let's open the HTML and add some form fields for the latitude and longitude. Eventually it would be nice if the user could click on a map, but for now we're just going to have them enter the latitude and longitude manually. Back in the JavaScript, we now want to replace the hard-coded values with values read from the inputs using jQuery. So now we can change the latitude and longitude here, then click refresh and it will update with the new position. But it would be nicer to be able to just type values in the fields and have it refresh automatically. So let's go back to the code and set up some event handlers. The change event only fires when you move focus away from the field. It would be nicer if we didn't have to do that, so let's bind the key press event as well. Let's try it now with these new events hooked up. I'll just open up the JavaScript console so we can see when it refreshes. So let's see what flyovers are happening in New York right now. I just happen to know that the coordinates to enter are 4.71 and 74, but I could have got them off Google Maps as well. So that worked. But if you look at the console you can see that it makes a lot of requests. One for each keystroke I made while typing in those coordinates. What we'd really like to do is not make a new request every time we see a key press, but instead wait a second and see if the user presses anything else. If they don't change anything for half a second, then we assume they've done and we refresh the data. Underscore has a function that does exactly this and it's called debounce. You give debounce a function of your own and it gives you back a new function that you can call as many times as you want. But only after you stop calling it for a certain amount of time will it actually call the function you gave. I'll set it to wait for half a second after the last call by passing in 500 milliseconds as the second argument to debounce. And it's as simple as that. With this one change it still works and it feels pretty snappy. I can type in the coordinates here and it still is updating pretty much as soon as I finished. But looking at the console you can see it's made a lot less requests. In this video, we looked at the debounce method of underscore and how it can be used to make sure that a function is called only after whatever is triggering it has stopped happening. In the next video, we'll be looking at the after method, which lets you make a function that only does something after being called a set number of times. Hope to see you there. Welcome to the last video of section 4. In this video, we'll look at the underscore after function and we'll use it to help speed up our API requests by making them parallel. Here's the latest version of our ISS flyovers app. In this video, we're going to make a small but important improvement. Right now we're loading data from 3 different sources and we're doing it sequentially. As you can see, we first request the flyover data, then, once we have that, we request the weather data. And finally, once we have both of those, we request the people in space data. It would be better to request all these in parallel, so we don't need to wait for the last one to finish before requesting the next. First, let's factor out the code that requests each bit of data. This function is going to request data from a URL and store it as a property on the object. We're still requesting the data using jQuery's getJSON, but when we get it, we'll just store it onto the object using the property provided. So let's add some calls to this now. I'm just copy-pasting the URL from the call it's going to replace down here. I'm doing the request for the flyby data first. And let's put the other 2 in as well. I can also copy-paste the URL and the options for these 2. Here's the one to grab the weather data. The astronauts one doesn't need any options passed, so I'll pass in an empty object for consistency. And now that's in as well. Let's now delete the lines we just replaced. But there's an important thing this new code isn't doing. It's not making a call to got refreshed data. So where should the call go now? Maybe in here. Except that's not right, because it's now going to be called 3 times. Now we don't know what order these requests are going to complete in, so we can't just say call got refreshed data after you get the astronauts. Instead, we want to say call it after we've got all 3 bits of data. And luckily, Underscore.js has a method that can help us with that. The function is called after, and what you do is you pass it a number and a function. I'm going to pass 3 and got refreshed data. 3 because that's the number of URLs we're requesting. Now that we have this complete function, you can call it once and nothing will happen. You can call it twice and still nothing will happen. But you call it a 3rd time and it will call got refreshed data. That's just what we need in get data here, so let's add a call. Now there's still one issue. We're no longer passing in the arguments that got refreshed data is expecting. But we do now have them as properties on the object, so let's update it to use them instead of taking arguments. We can get rid of these debug outputs now actually, we don't need them anymore. So let's just use the astronauts property here, and the same for the ISS data here. We'll need to store the this variable here, so we can use it to access the weather property here. With those bits fixed, we can test it and we can see that it's all still working. But now we know that all 3 requests for data are being made at the same time, giving a faster and nicer user experience, especially on slower connections. In this video, we looked at the after underscore function and used it to help make our previously serial data requests parallel. This is the end of section 4. In the next and final section, we'll look at how to use underscore templates to output HTML, and that's an alternative way of using the functions we've seen already using underscore's chaining syntax. Hope to see you there. Welcome to section 5, the final section of this course. In this video, we're going to look at the HTML templating engine that comes with underscore. This lets you take a template and combine it with some data to produce HTML to display to the user. It's an alternative to manipulating the DOM as we have been up to this point, which helps separate our concerns and keeps our code neat. So here's the ISS flyovers app we've been working on. This time we're not going to add any functionality, but instead we're going to make it a bit prettier by changing the HTML we use to display the entries. The entries for the days are looking a bit plain at the moment. Since we're using the Bootstrap CSS framework, we might as well use a component from that to make them look nicer. Let's use the panel component from Bootstrap. We'll use a panel for each day with the date as the title. Then we can use the list group component for the actual flyovers. Of course you could do some custom CSS here if you've got a little bit more time and make it look much nicer, but this will do for now. Right now we're looping over the days, and for each day we loop over the flyovers, and use this output flyover function to generate the HTML for each of those flyovers. Now we could just modify this code to output the extra markup, but it's going to get messy pretty fast. I'm going to comment out this code for now, and we'll build a replacement for it. So let's make a template we can use instead. I create a template using the underscore template method. I'm going to create a very simple template first, just so we can see how they work, then we can extend it later. Underscore.js uses a simple templating language. We write normal HTML in here, but we can add this special tag and put JavaScript code inside it. Now dayTemplate is holding a compiled template which we can use just like a function. You pass in data and it gives back HTML. So let's call this template here and attach the resulting HTML to the DOM. We're passing in the day which we used in the little template we wrote above. Right now this isn't doing much, but bear with me. Let's just check it's working so far. So we now have it outputting the headings and using the template, but of course we're not outputting the flyovers right now, so let's fix that. I want to add more to the template, but if I do that I'll have exactly the same issue as I had when I was manually putting together the HTML. It'll just get messy. What we really want is to split the template off, so it's not just stuck in the middle of the code. So here's a way to put a template into the index file along with the rest of the HTML. What we do is we create a script tag, and we give it a type of text/template. This tells the browser that it's not JavaScript, so it won't try to do anything with it by default. I'll give it an ID so we can refer to it later. We can put the template right in here. Now, instead of hard coding the template here, we use jQuery to grab the contents of the script tag and use that instead. Remember that we set the ID of the script tag to dayTemplate, and we can see that it works just the same with the template in the HTML file as it did before. Let's go make the template a bit more useful. So let's add in the wrapper HTML that we want. So first we're going to have a panel with default style. Now that's going to have a heading and give it the correct class. Now let's add a panel body below that, and inside that we want a list group. Now inside the list group we want the actual flyovers for the day, but first we need to pass in the flyover data. So let's pass in the flyovers for the day here. We'll call them just flyovers inside the template, so that's all I need to do to pass them in. Back at the template, I now want to loop over the flyovers and output HTML for each one. So I start a JavaScript block, and this time I leave out the equals sign so it won't actually print out anything. Instead, I'm going to wrap two of these blocks around an HTML bit. Inside here I'll start the loop. Now I could just use a regular JavaScript for statement, but the really cool thing is that I can use underscore itself inside underscore templates. So I'm actually using the each function. Now I need to add another JavaScript block below to end the loop. I add the closing brace and the closing bracket here. And now between these we can put some HTML that will be repeated for each iteration of the loop. So we output the start time of the flyover, formatting it nicely using the toLocalTimeString method of the JavaScript date object. Now we output the duration, first getting the minutes and now the seconds. Finally, let's output the weather description. Notice how I've used the equals sign in each of these blocks so it outputs whatever the JavaScript expression returns. Now that's looking a lot nicer. In this video we saw how to use Underscore's simple templating facility. There are lots of more advanced templating libraries available, but often Underscore's is just what's needed. Join me in the next video when we'll look at a totally different way of calling the underscore functions we've seen so far, using something called chaining. Welcome to the second video of section 5. In this video we're going to look at chaining, which is an alternative way of calling the underscore functions you've seen in the previous videos. In this video we're going to be making a lot of changes to the source code, but we'll be keeping the functionality the same. Let's have a play in the JavaScript console first though. I'll just create a simple function first. So I can use this with a simple map as we've seen lots of times before, and I get back the result. Let's take the result of map and run the max function on it, giving us the maximum of the values. There's another way to write that. We can use the chain function, which returns an object on which we can call any underscore function as a method. These methods will also return one of these objects, so we can chain the underscore methods. Of course, at some point we'd like to get back the result, not one of these chaining objects, and for that we can use the value method. Okay, let's give this a try on our project code. The first thing I'm going to do is make this map use a named function. This will make things a bit clearer later on. Using named functions instead of anonymous ones can sometimes make code easier to read and easier to refactor. Now it becomes a little more clear that we do have a pipeline here. We're taking response data at the top and processing it with successive underscore functions. So let's try out the chaining syntax here. We start by calling chain on the input data. Now this map function can be called on the chaining objects. And the where and group by calls are each running on the output of the previous one, so they can also become part of the chain. I'll just need to move this line up above so that the template is ready when we need it. And even if each call is just part of the chain. The summary displaying code here is a little tricky. It wants the data from before we call group by to group it by days, but we no longer have that variables as it's just part of the chain. I'll show you a way to fix this, but first let's wrap it in a function, and then move that above with the other functions. Now we can use a method underscore has just for chains called tap. This will take the current value at the position in the chain and call a function with it. The value will then pass unchanged down the chain. So we insert the tap into the chain here and have it pass the intermediate value into the show summary function we just created. And there we have it, the same functionality, but now instead of being all over the place we can follow the logic in just a few lines down here. Let's just quickly check that it's all still working. We'll open the browser and refresh, and it looks like it is. In this video we saw the alternative chaining syntax that we can use to call some of underscore's functions. It's not always appropriate, but used in the right place it can help improve code clarity. Join me in the next and final video of this course, where we'll look at some of the add-ons and additions available for underscore, before looking beyond underscore at libraries like Lodash.js. Welcome to the last video of section 5, and to the very last video of this course. In this video we're going to look beyond underscore at some other libraries that complement it, or ones that attempt to replace it entirely. In this course we haven't had time to cover anywhere near all of the functions that Underscore.js has to offer. So now you've had a taste of underscore, I highly recommend spending some time with the excellent documentation and seeing what else it might be able to do to help you. When you want to know more about how underscore works, you can check out the annotated source. You'll find it's very clearly written and usually pretty easy to understand. You'll find loads of great examples of how to use underscore since it uses itself internally. But even once you've mastered all of underscore's functions, there's still more. Underscore contrib has a whole load of functions that didn't quite make it into underscore, and some that at some point might in the future. Finally, there's Lodash. Lodash is a replacement for underscore which has a lot of additional functions and is written for speed and customizability. If you don't mind losing the simplicity and consistency of underscore, then Lodash provides a lot of useful things and it can often be a lot faster. Lodash can produce custom builds containing just the methods you need, or supporting a more limited subset of browsers in return for increased performance. Lodash's documentation isn't quite as succinct as underscore's, but it does give more detail. One last little thing that isn't really related to underscore, but which I did find very useful when developing on OS X is Dash. It's a documentation viewer that you can trigger with a hotkey, and can be loaded with lots of documentation, including underscores for easy access. It's not free, but I think it's worth it. Check out the Mac App Store. I'm not affiliated in any way with Dash, by the way, I just use it. If you're on Windows, then Zeal looks very similar to Dash. In this video we saw the underscore contrib library which adds additional functions for use with underscore, and Lodash which replaces underscore completely. Thanks for watching Rapid Underscore. I hope you've enjoyed the course.